Today, Hitler is viewed as a warmonger, which is fair enough once the war kicked off. He did declare war on about a dozen countries during the course of the war. Some will by guarantee, such as the United States, or some simply because they were in the way, like Luxembourg or Denmark. Whilst we can say it was necessary militarily to do some of these, that doesn't make them justified, although the occupation was pretty much as benevolent as they could be under the circumstances for countries like Denmark or Luxembourg. But what about the actual lead up to the war? Hitler's peaceful conquests of Austria, Czechoslovakia, part of Lithuania, and then the violent conquest of Poland are lumped in together. But were these acts justified? It's taboo to talk about, but you'd be surprised. A quick background on the founding of Germany. For all of German history, Germans were separated into literally hundreds, maybe even thousands at points, of tiny, semi-independent states under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire. Over time, and especially in the late 19th century, these states gradually merged into one. Prussia, under a variety of means. Only one stayed independent due to their large, mostly non-German empire of their own, Austria. At the end of the Treaty of Versailles, one of the terms was that Austria, now stripped of her empire and a tiny nation wedged between larger nations, was forbidden to unite with her larger, ethnic German brother, Germany. The same way Castile and Aragon became Spain, Muscovy and Novgorod became Russia, Moldavia and Wallachia became Romania, Austria and Germany were now told that they could not do the same. In reality, there wasn't really much of a way to practically stop this if the populations of both wanted it to go ahead. In Austria, there was a huge Nazi party movement, and at one point, a violent coup where the Chancellor, Dollfuss, was assassinated. Hitler kept his distance to a degree and was furious. He wanted the two peoples to come together naturally. He viewed a customs union or some kind of semi-integrated but autonomous Austria was possible, without too much of a fuss abroad, as much as he'd have loved his home country to become at one with the Reich. Then the opportunity fell into his lap. At a meeting with the new Austrian Chancellor, sorry Germans for the pronunciation I'm sure, von Schuschnigg, Hitler made all kinds of demands and threats to him, which was mostly hot air, but the Chancellor took them very seriously. He came home, and after losing his head a few times, called a plebiscite to prove that the Austrians didn't want a union with Germany, and that Hitler shouldn't be messing with their internal affairs. After a very complicated series of events, it ended with the German army walking into Austria to the joy of the local population. In English, we call this the Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany. In Germany, mostly at the time, it was called the Flower War. As the Austrians threw flowers at the incoming German troops, the vast majority of the population was overjoyed to finally be united in one German nation. It was very hard for any major power to justify intervening with the Anschluss. Even Mussolini's Italy, who had guaranteed Austria's independence, was happy enough to let it go ahead. If Italy wasn't going to, no one else would. After all, wasn't it simply the conclusion of a much larger historical trend? It's very hard to argue against the Anschluss, even the most ardent Hitler haters probably wouldn't. Post-war, it's made to seem as if the Austrians were pushed into this unwillingly to avoid backlash after the war, but in reality, the Austrians were far overrepresented in the SS and extremely willing participants. After the Anschluss, Czechoslovakia's 3 million Germans began kicking up a fuss for unification with their ethnic fatherland. Czechoslovakia was a weird country. It was created at the end of World War I based on sketchy maps, which resulted in an absolute mess. Czechs were only 47% of the population, and they only constituted a majority due to adding Slovakia into the mix, who weren't really overly keen on Czech domination. When asked why he gave these Germans over to the Czechs, when the whole idea of peace in the First World War was national self-determination, Woodrow Wilson simply said, alright, I'll just put it on the screen. Never told me that. Even a year after its creation, the large Hungarian and German minorities were petitioning the League of Nations to return to their ethnic nation-states. The Czechs waited far too long to grant any autonomy, and the parliament was totally dominated by Czechs, so they ended up with a very unhappy minority, but in reality, majority, as the Slovakians didn't want any part of the state either. A rebellious nationalism arose in the German lands that transformed into National Socialism. The Czechs were nominally allied with France and the Soviets, and had one of the best equipped armies in Europe. The Sudetenland being mountainous was bad enough, but it was one of the best fortified places in Europe, along with France's Maginot Line. Hitler felt this was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Reich. In 1938, rumours began flying around that Germany was about to invade. This time, it was false, and there was reason to believe that this was planted by the Czech government to humiliate Hitler. It was, in fact, the Czechs themselves who had mobilised on the border. To prove this was all made up, German officers escorted British military advisors along the border. When no attack came, the Czechs bragged about how they had forced Hitler to back down, and this became the media narrative all over the world. Hitler was furious and went into a rage, claiming he'd wiped the Czechs off the map, and the usual kind of bluster you'd expect from a Hitler rant. He was burning to get even. By this point, Chamberlain was sick of the Czechs, who'd caused the fake crisis, and he also knew that the Czech government was paying British cabinet ministers, such as Winston Churchill, indirectly, to oust him from office and be replaced with someone who would go to war with Germany. Chamberlain claimed he didn't give two hoots whether the Sudeten Germans were in or out of the Reich. He was all too happy to negotiate if it meant a further peace in Europe. This was known as appeasement. After a crisis, eventually things were settled with Mussolini acting as mediator and the British happily signing away the German areas of Czechoslovakia. The Czechs had no choice but to accept. Was this justified though? It was long overdue from a historical perspective. Before the First World War, these Germans held a privileged place in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had had a very unhappy time under their new Czech overlords. After all the fuss the Czechs had caused and how little they'd offered the Germans to want to stay in their state, it's hard to argue against it. The Czechs reluctantly gave up their heavily fortified border with Germany. Immediately after the Sudeten Germans seceded, the other minorities such as the Hungarians, Slovakians and the Ukrainians in Ruthenia began agitating to be set free from Czech rule too. The Germans had been helping them along with this, agitating them to keep doing so as they went. A border dispute arose between Hungary and the Czechs over southern Slovakia, which was an ethnically Hungarian majority area. The Germans offered to mediate, and eventually the lands were returned to Horthy's Hungary. During the Sudeten crisis, Poland had opportunistically seized the coal-rich area of Zaolzie from the Czechs, and months later took areas of northern Slovakia by force. By now, the Czech state was falling apart. On the 7th of March 1939, the Czech president dismissed the Ruthenian government. 3 days later, he did the same with the Slovak government as they were pushing for independence. The Czechs occupied Bratislava by force and installed a new loyal government. Father Tiso, the clerical fascist Slovak prime minister, fled to Vienna and appealed for German help. He was told to declare independence immediately if he wanted German help, otherwise he wouldn't stop the Hungarians marching in and taking the rest of Slovakia. The Hungarian troops were already on the border. The next day, Slovakia declared independence. The Ruthenians followed suit. The Czech state now barely existed in reality. Hungary was allowed to march into Ruthenia. Hitler had done Stalin a huge favour. The Ukrainian nationalism that was ablaze in the area, which would have caused huge problems in the Soviet Union, was extinguished. Perhaps he was courting Stalin as early as March 1939. The Czech president, Hácha, asked to meet Hitler. He was elderly and sick. It started off well with Ribbentrop presenting his daughter with a bouquet of flowers at the train station and Hitler sending a box of chocolates. It then took a dark turn as Hácha was bullied for 3 hours, threatened with the brutal invasion of his country, and he suffered a heart attack. German doctors revived him, and he eventually, with great reluctance, signed away his country to Germany. The Czech lands of Czechoslovakia became a protectorate of Germany. Nominally, Hitler claimed this was to restore order, as the Czech state was collapsing in on itself, which to a degree was true, but ridiculous at the same time. Hácha stated, "Our people will curse us, and yet we have saved their existence. We have preserved them from a horrible massacre." Hitler was grateful to Hácha for signing away his nation for the rest of his life. He kept the Czech cabinet for a time, and when he was rid of them, paid their pensions. On the 15th of March, German troops quickly marched in and occupied the border with Poland, who it appeared was preparing to invade for a third time at a moment of weakness, as they had done last year. To Hitler and the Germans, this all appeared as a return to the norm. For most of Czech history, they had been part of the Holy Roman Empire or directly under German rule. Czech independence to them was a novelty of history. What Hitler cared about most was returning ethnic German lands to the Reich. So far, this had fallen in his lap with the plebiscite in Austria and the fake crisis before the real one in Czechoslovakia. However, this side quest had cost him dearly. By acting in the moment and assisting Slovakia, they had made themselves out like monsters in the international community. The press had a field day in Britain, France, and the United States. What was left of the Czech state was effectively a vassal state of Germany by now anyway, entirely at their mercy. Why inflame things by marching troops in? Hitler's international reputation went up in flames. Chamberlain, who had put his faith in Hitler, felt betrayed, and rightly so. By taking the Czech lands, Hitler had made his actual job of getting the German people back into the Reich a lot harder. He had, however, gained a bargaining chip to use with Poland, or so he thought. He imagined the Poles could be talked into returning Danzig for concessions in Slovakia. He was wrong. If there was ever a time not to inflame things further, it was now. In the same month, on a return trip from Rome, the Lithuanian foreign minister was invited to meet Ribbentrop in Berlin. He was given an ultimatum. Return Memel, the German area of Lithuania, which had been clamouring for independence for years, and had its own Nazi party, or else the Führer would act with lightning speed. Memel had been seized in 1923 from a disarmed Germany. After seeing what had just happened to the Czechs, he needed no convincing. On the 23rd of March, the German army marched in. Although this was entirely justified and righting a historical wrong, was just weeks after the Czech debacle a great time to do this? Obviously not, and things were quickly spinning out of control. 3 days later, things got even worse. German-Polish talks over Danzig broke down.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man.
On March the 16th, Romania's minister in London, Virgil Talea, ran to the Foreign Office to warn that he had learned from secret and other sources that the Nazis planned to overrun Hungary, invade Romania, and establish a protectorate over the entire country like they had done to the Czechs. He claimed Hitler's objective was to Ploiest oil fields. Talea asked for a loan of £10 million to strengthen Romania's defences. This was total fiction. Germany had a trade agreement to be signed a week later with Romania, had no issue with Romania, and didn't even share a border with her. The regime in Bucharest told London that no such ultimatum had been sent by Germany, and that this was all news to them. Talea, however, spread his story. He appealed to Lord Halifax and hounded him with questions, asking if Britain would back Romania if they fought. Would Britain draw a line where Germany must not go, else they face war? For some freak reason of history, which appears to have escaped the popular narrative of the war somehow, the British government believed Talea. I was going to include the final episode of this drama, Danzig, in this video, but now that I'm sat here with pages of notes and several books in front of me, it looks like it's a video on its own. So in the end, up until the establishment of the Czech Protectorate, German demands weren't at all unreasonable, and Chamberlain was more than happy to play ball. He saw it as righting the wrongs of Versailles to a degree. Chamberlain was an honest man. Hitler took advantage of this though, and betrayed his trust. Danzig most likely could have been taken in the future without it coming to war, and who knows how many lives could have been saved, or if war would have ever broken out at all. This, mixed with the Romanian war scare, resulted in an about-face of British foreign policy. There would be no more appeasing Hitler, and war was all but inevitable. Hitler had given the warmongers in the British cabinet like Winston Churchill the ammo they needed against Chamberlain. Chamberlain would not be so accommodating to Germany next time, as much as he wanted to be. To conclude, Anschluss was perfectly reasonable, and so was the Sudetenland. Even supporting Slovakian independence could have been seen as benevolent had Hitler played his cards better. The Czech regime was hardly beloved throughout Europe. Why not let the Czechs fall apart themselves rather than marching in to complete the collapse? I guess we'll never know what Hitler was thinking, but it certainly wasn't part of his long-term strategy. When it came to trying to negotiate Danzig, I'm sure he regretted it.